The moment of impact, Zoraida looked at the iron grip clamped around the man's wrist, then up at the face of the person who held it. Her mind was stalling, trying to process a reality that didn't fit into any of her usual boxes. Because this man, this tall, impeccably dressed Korean man in a charcoal suit, was someone she had only ever seen from a distance, a ghost in the penthouse suite. Now he was standing in the middle of the Grand Lotus lobby, stopping a physical assault meant for her. Behind them, Sang-woo's face contorted, his drunken rage suddenly replaced by a cold, soul-deep terror. The elites on the velvet couches went silent, their gossip dying in their throats as they realized the nobody, Maid, was now under the protection of the city's most dangerous shadow. If this moment of pure vindication already has you hooked, then smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell. We bring you powerful stories of protection and justice just like this one. And besties, don't forget you can get the exclusive details of Rowoon and Zora's journey by clicking the link in the description to join our mailing list. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Now, let's take you back to the beginning, to the cold reality of Zora's life and soul before the tiger stepped in. Besties, let's get back to the story. The Grand Lotus Hotel stood as a shimmering monument to wealth in a district where money didn't just talk, it commanded. It was a place of gold-leafed ceilings, marble floors buffed to a mirror shine, and a level of service that was expected to be flawless, immediate, and, above all, silent. The hotel did exactly what the five-star rating demanded and stopped precisely there, treating its staff like the hidden gears of a clock, essential for the function, but never meant to be seen. Zoraida Vance had no memory of a time when she wasn't space. To the management, she was a unit of labor. To the guests, she was a backdrop. Do you think the guests feel comfortable with someone your size handling their linens? You have such a pretty face. It's a shame about the rest. She heard it so often it stopped sounding like an insult and started sounding like a ledger, a list of facts about her existence that had been researched, confirmed, and filed away. She had learned to move through the halls like a ghost, shrinking herself until she was almost invisible. Until the day Sang-woo decided she wasn't shrinking fast enough, and Rowoon decided he had seen enough. The sun never seemed to shine quite right inside the Grand Lotus Hotel. Instead, the air was filled with the fake, golden glow of heavy chandeliers that cost more than Zoraida Vance would earn in 10 years. Zora moved through the wide hallways like a shadow that didn't belong to any specific person. Her shifts were 12 hours long, a never-ending cycle of scrubbing marble and tucking silk sheets until her fingers felt numb and her back hummed with a dull ache. In the high society world of Seoul, Zora was more than just a maid. She was a ghost in a blue and white striped uniform. Being a plus-size black woman in a place that valued being thin and pale felt like a separate sentence she had to serve every day. As she pushed her heavy cleaning cart down the plush carpets, she could feel the eyes of the guests sliding over her. They didn't look at her face. They looked at the way her uniform fit tightly over her curves. They looked at the dark skin of her arms as she polished the brass handles of the elevator. To them, she wasn't Zora. She was a mistake in the scenery. The cruelty at the Grand Lotus wasn't always loud. Most of the time, it was polite. It was the way a wealthy woman would pull her expensive silk skirt aside when Zora walked past, as if Zora were something messy that might rub off on her. It was the way the head housekeeper, Mrs. Park, would sigh deeply while looking at Zora's waistline during morning inspection. The fabric is struggling, Zoraida, she would say with a thin, fake smile. Perhaps you should skip the staff lunch today, for the sake of the professional look. Zora would just nod, keep her eyes on the floor, and say, "Yes, ma'am." She had learned that speaking up only made the target on her back bigger. She had traveled all the way from America for a fresh start, but she found that the shape of leaving followed her across the ocean. In her small staff locker, she kept a picture of her mother, but even that didn't stop the loneliness from creeping in during the long, silent nights. The guests were the hardest part. They treated her like a piece of furniture that could clean. One afternoon, while Zora was kneeling to scrub a stubborn coffee stain off a suite floor, A young businessman stepped over her, as if she were a rug. He didn't say excuse me. He just checked his gold watch and complained loudly on his phone about how the help was getting in the way of his path. Zora stayed on her knees, her heart thumping against her ribs, waiting for him to pass. She was tired of shrinking herself. She was tired of trying to be invisible so that people wouldn't have anything to comment on. But at the Grand Lotus, visibility was dangerous. To be seen was to be judged, and Zora knew she didn't fit the mold they wanted. She counted the hours until her shift ended, unaware that the quiet, charcoal-suited man in the penthouse was already watching the way the world treated her, and he was a man who hated seeing things out of order. The trouble did not start all at once. It began like a small leak in a ceiling, a few drops of cruelty that slowly turned into a flood. The man's name was Sang-woo, and from the moment he checked into the Grand Lotus, he seemed to decide that Zora was his personal target. He was a wealthy businessman who always looked a bit messy, with his tie loosened and a permanent scowl on his FA. To Sang-woo, the world was divided into people who mattered and people who were tools. He clearly put Zora in the second category. On the first day, it was a mistake. Zora was replacing the towels in his suite when he dropped a glass of red wine right at her feet. The dark liquid splashed on her white stockings and the hem of her blue uniform. He didn't apologize. Instead, he laughed a sharp, dry laugh. "Look at that," he said, pointing at the floor. "You're already down there, so you might as well get a scrubbing. And try not to eat the glass. You look like you've had enough today." Zora's face burned with heat, but she stayed quiet. She wiped the floor while he stood over her, breathing heavily and watching her every move. By the second day, the mistakes became intentional. Sang-woo would call the front desk every hour, claiming his room was filthy even after Zora had spent 2 hours polishing every inch of it. When she arrived to fix it, he would toss his dirty shoes onto the bed she had just made. He would watch her heavy breathing as she worked, making comments about her size and her skin. "Do they grow them this big where you come from?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. "It must be hard to find a uniform that doesn't scream for mercy." Zora tried to be a ghost. She tried to let the words slide off her like water off a window pane, but the weight was getting heavier. Her heart would start to race the moment she saw his room number on her list. The other maids saw what was happening, but they looked away. No one wanted to lose their job over a guest who spent millions at the hotel. On the third day, the air in the hallway felt thick and cold. Zora was cleaning the mirrors near the elevator when Sang-woo walked out his room. He looked angrier than usual. His eyes were red, and he smelled like he had been drinking. When he saw Zora, he didn't just walk past. He stopped right in front of her cleaning cart, blocking her path. "I told the manager you stole my watch," he lied, his voice loud enough for the other guests to hear. Zora's heart dropped in her stomach. "I didn't take anything, sir," she whispered, her hands shaking as she held her cleaning rag. This was the lie she feared most. In a place like the Grand Lotus, the word of a billionaire was law, and the word of a maid meant nothing. Sang-woo stepped closer, his face inches from hers. He looked at her with pure hate, as if her very existence was an insult to his expensive surroundings. "Don't talk back to me," he snapped. He raised his hand, his fingers curling into a fist. Zora closed her eyes and pulled her rag to her chest, waiting for the blow to land. She felt the rush of air as his arms swung forward, but the hit never came. Instead, there was a sudden, heavy silence that felt like the entire world had stopped breathing. Before the chaos in the hallway, there was the silence of the top floor. The penthouse suite was a place where even the air felt more expensive. It was Zora's job to clean it, but she was given very strict rules. Mrs. Park had pulled her aside on her first day with a look of pure seriousness. "Room 5001 is different, Zoraida," she had whispered. "The guest there does not want to be seen. You enter, you clean, and you leave. You do not look him in the eye. You do not speak unless you are spoken to. In fact, it is better if you act like the room is empty, even if he is standing right there." The guest was Rowoon. To the rest of the hotel staff, he was a shadow. He didn't make loud demands like Sang-woo, and he didn't throw his clothes on the floor. In many ways, he was the perfect guest, yet he was the one everyone feared the most. Whenever Zora entered his suite, she felt a strange shiver run down her spine. The room was always perfectly still, decorated in dark woods and deep leathers that smelled like expensive rain and old books. Zora would move through the suite with soft steps, making sure her cleaning cart didn't squeak on the polished floors. Sometimes she would catch a glimpse of him. Rowoon was often standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the city of Seoul, as if he owned every light and every building below. He was always dressed in a dark, perfectly tailored suit, his back straight and his shoulders broad. He looked like a king who was tired of his crown. One afternoon, while Zora was dusting a shelf of heavy glass awards, she accidentally knocked over a small silver pen. It hit the floor with a tiny clink that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. Zora froze, her breath hitching in her throat. She waited for the scolding, for the polite cruelty she was used to, or for him to call the manager to complain about the clumsy maid. Rowoon didn't turn around immediately. He stood still for a long moment before slowly rotating his head. Zora kept her eyes glued to the carpet, remembering Mrs. Park's warning. She could feel his gaze on her, but it didn't feel like the dirty, judging stare of Sang-woo. It felt heavy and observant, like he was reading a book that no one else had bothered to open. He didn't say a word. He simply walked over, picked up the pen with a steady hand, and placed it back on the shelf. His movements were smooth and calm, like a big cat moving through the forest. When he stepped near her, Zora noticed how clean and sharp he smelled. For a second, she felt like a person instead of a ghost. He didn't look at her uniform or her size with a sneer. He just existed in the same space as her, acknowledging her presence without making her feel small. As she left the room that day, Zora felt a strange sense of safety that she couldn't explain. She didn't know his name was Rowoon yet, and she didn't know he was a mafia boss. All she knew was that in a building full of people who looked down on her, the man in the penthouse was the only one who seemed to truly see her. She didn't know that this quiet shadow was about to become the only thing standing between her and Sang-woo's raised fist. The air in the Grand Lotus lobby felt like it had turned to ice. Sang-woo was shouting now, his face red and twisted with a mean kind of joy. He looked at Zora as if she were nothing more than a bug he was about to crush. "You're done here," he roared, pulling his arm back. He swung a heavy, closed fist right towards Zora's face. Zora didn't try to run. She just pulled her cleaning rag to her chest and squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the pain that she was sure was coming. But the hit never landed. There was a sound like a wet branch snapping, followed by a sudden, sharp gasp from the crowd. Zora opened her eyes and saw a sight that made her heart skip a beat. A hand, coming from a sleeve of perfectly tailored dark charcoal fabric, had reached out and caught Sang-woo's wrist in midair. The grip was so steady and strong that Sang-woo looked like he had been frozen in time. Standing there was the man from the penthouse. Rowoon didn't look angry. He looked bored, which was somehow even scarier. He didn't break a sweat or raise his voice. He just stood there like a wall of iron, his fingers locked around Sang-woo's arm. The expensive-looking patrons on the leather couches covered their mouths, and the hotel staff stood as still as statues. "You are being very loud," Rowoon said. His voice was quiet and calm, but it filled the entire room. He didn't look at the crowd. He kept his eyes locked onto Sang-woo, whose face was quickly turning from red to a pale, ghostly white. "Let go of me. Do you know who my father is?" Sang-woo barked, but his voice was shaking. He tried to pull away, but Rowoon didn't move. Instead, Rowoon slowly twisted Sang-woo's wrist. With a small cry of pain, the wealthy businessman was forced down until he was kneeling on the hard marble floor. Rowoon finally looked over at Zora. His expression was like a mask of cold discipline, but for a split second, his eyes seemed to check if she was okay. Then, he looked back down at the man on his knees. "This woman is not for you to touch," Rowoon said. "In fact, you're the one who is making this floor dirty. Apologize. Now." Sang-woo looked around at the other elites, his pride breaking in front of everyone. I'm sorry," he muttered towards Zora's shoes. "Lower," Rowoon commanded. What happened next was the part that shocked everyone. Rowoon didn't let him go. He took a dirty cleaning rag from Zora's cart and dropped it on his Sang-woo's expensive blazer. Since you think the help is so invisible, perhaps you should learn their job. Scrub the wine you spilled yesterday. All of it. If there's a single spot left when I come back, you will answer to me. The lobby stayed silent as the billionaire customer, the man who had treated Zora like trash for days, began to scrub the floor on his hands and knees. Zora stood behind Rowoon, feeling a strange new warmth in her chest. For the first time in her life, she wasn't the one shrinking. She was standing behind a shield that no one in Seoul dared to cross. The lobby of the Grand Lotus remained as silent as a grave as Rowoon finally released Sang-woo's wrist. The businessman scrambled backward, his expensive suit now damp and wrinkled from the floor. He looked around at the other wealthy guests, his face twisted with a mix of shame and a new, burning anger. "You can't do this," Sang-woo hissed, his voice cracking. "I'll have her fired by sunset. I'll sue this hotel and make sure she never finds a job in this country again. She's nothing but a common thief and a maid." Zora felt a familiar, cold prickle of fear return to her chest. She knew how the world worked. Even if Rowoon had saved her for a moment, Sang-woo had the money and the lawyers to destroy her life. She looked down at her scuffed shoes, waiting for the manager to come out and hand her a pink slip. But Rowoon didn't move. He didn't even look at Sang-woo. He simply reached into his charcoal jacket and pulled out a small, dark card. "She doesn't work for the hotel anymore," Rowoon said. His voice was calm, but it had a weight to it that made everyone lean in to listen. He turned toward the hotel manager, who had finally scurried out from behind the desk, looking pale and nervous. Rowoon didn't ask a question. He made a statement. "Zoraida Vance is now my personal assistant. Any legal threats made against her are now threats made against my organization. If Mr. Sang-woo wishes to speak to her, he will have to go through my office first." The manager stammered, nodding his head so fast it looked like it might fall off. "Of course, Mr. Rowoon, whatever you say. We will process her resignation immediately." Zora's mouth fell open. She looked at Rowoon's back, her heart thumping like a drum. She was a maid from America who barely knew 10 words of Korean, and now the most powerful man in the building was claiming her as his own. Sang-woo's eyes went wide. He seemed to recognize the name Rowoon for the first time, and the realization of who he had just tried to fight made him go completely quiet. He stood up, grabbed his messy jacket, and hurried toward the exit without another word. Rowoon finally turned to face Zora. He stood so close that she could smell the sharp, clean scent of his cologne. He didn't look at her like she was a servant or a problem. He looked at her like a person he had decided to keep. "Follow me," he said. It wasn't a request, but it wasn't mean either. It was the sound of a door opening to a new life. Zora hesitated for only a second. She looked at her heavy cleaning cart, the rag she had squeezed until her knuckles were white, and the lobby full of people who had watched her get bullied for weeks. Then, she looked at the man in the charcoal suit. For the first time since she had arrived in Seoul, she didn't feel like she had to shrink. She stepped away from the cart and followed him toward the private elevators, walking under the shadow of the tiger's wing. Walking into Rowoon's world felt like stepping onto another planet. The private elevator didn't just take Zora to the top floor. It took her away from everything she knew. For the first time, she wasn't pushing a heavy cart. Her hands were empty, and her heart was beating with a mix of fear and wonder. When the doors opened, she wasn't met by the smell of cleaning chemicals. Instead, the air smelled like expensive leather and fresh lilies. Rowoon led her into a large room where several men in dark suits were waiting. They were tall and looked very tough, with scars and cold eyes that made Zora want to hide. As soon as Rowoon entered, every single man bowed deeply. The silence was so heavy you could hear a pin drop. Zora saw the way they looked at her, with confusion and a hint of terror. They didn't look at her like she was a fat maid. They looked at her with fear because she was standing next to Rowoon. To them, being near the boss meant she was someone dangerous, too. "Take her to the dressing room," Rowoon commanded. His voice was like a calm tide. "Find things that suit her, not the rags the hotel provides. Real clothes." Zora was led away by 2 quiet women into a room filled with racks of silk, velvet, and fine wool. For years, Zora had struggled to find clothes that didn't make her feel like she was bursting at the seams. She was used to making do with whatever fit. But here, the women didn't sigh or look annoyed by her size. They pulled out deep emerald dresses and soft cream sweaters that looked like they were made of clouds. When Zora slipped into a dark green dress made of thick, stretchy silk, she gasped at her reflection. The fabric didn't pinch or pull. It flowed over her curves like water. For the first time in her life, the clothes didn't feel like a punishment. They felt like a hug. She looked at her dark skin against the rich green fabric and realized she didn't look messy. She looked powerful. When she walked back into the main room, the tough men in suits shifted uncomfortably. They kept their eyes on the floor. Rowoon was sitting in a large leather chair, reading a paper. He looked up, and for a long moment, he didn't say anything. His eyes traveled from her new shoes to the way the green dress fit her shoulders. He didn't smile, but the hard line of his jaw seemed to relax just a little bit. "Better," he said simply. He stood up and walked toward her. The other men backed away, as if he were a fire that might burn them. "From now on, Zoraida, you do not clean for anyone. You sit at my table. You eat when I eat." Zora looked at the expensive world around her. She saw the fear in the eyes of the strong men and the quiet respect in Rowoon's gaze. She realized that luxury wasn't just about gold watches or fancy hotels. It was the feeling of finally having a space that was actually big enough for her to stand in. She was no longer a ghost in the hallway. She was the woman at the center of the tiger's den. The peace of Zora's new life did not last long. Just as she was beginning to feel at home in the soft silks of her new wardrobe, the world outside Rowoon's suite began to howl. Sangwoo was not a man who moved on quietly. He was a man who used his family's money like a weapon, and he had decided that if he could not break Zora's spirit, he would break her future. It started with a knock on the heavy oak doors. Two men in stiff gray suits, looking like cold statues, stood in the hallway. They weren't mafia. They were government officials. They held papers that looked official and scary. "Zoraida Vance," one of them said, his voice flat. "There's been a report regarding your work visa. Your employment at the Grand Lotus has ended, and your sponsorship has been pulled. You have 48 hours to leave the country, or you will be deported." Zora felt the blood drain from her face. Everything she had worked for, every cent she had saved to come to Seoul, felt like it was blowing away in a cold wind. She looked at the papers and then at the men. She knew Sangwoo's father owned half the companies in the city. One phone call from him was all it took to turn her into an illegal stranger. Her hands began to shake, the emerald silk of her sleeves fluttering like the wings of a trapped bird. Before she could say a word, Rowoon stepped out from the shadows of the living room. He didn't look worried. He looked like a storm that had finally decided to break. He didn't look at the officials. He looked through them. He took the papers from their hands and slowly, very slowly, ripped them into tiny white pieces. He let the scraps fall to the floor like snow. "Go back to your office," Rowoon said. His voice was lower than Zora had ever heard it. It wasn't the voice of a protector now. It was the voice of a predator. "Tell the man who sent you that I do not follow his laws. Tell him that Zoraida Vance is under my name now. If he tries to touch her paper trail again, I will start touching his bank accounts. And then I will start touching his family's peace." The officials looked at Rowoon's eyes and visibly trembled. They didn't argue. They didn't even pick up the ripped paper. They turned and ran toward the elevators as if their lives depended on it. Rowoon turned to Zora. The dark, scary look in his eyes didn't vanish right away, and for a second, Zora felt a tiny prickle of fear. This was the dark side everyone whispered about. This was the man who could make powerful people disappear with a snap of his fingers. But then, he reached out and gently straightened her collar. "Do not pack your bags, Zora," he said quietly. "Nobody is sending you away. I have spent my life making sure the world stays in the order I choose. And in my world, you stay." Zora realized then that protection came with a price. To be safe, she had to be tied to a man who lived outside the rules. She looked at the ripped papers on the floor and knew there was no going back to being just a maid. She was part of something much bigger and much more dangerous now. They turned and ran toward the elevators as if their lives depended on it. Rowoon turned to Zora. The dark, scary look in his eyes didn't vanish right away, and for a second, Zora felt a tiny prickle of fear. This was the dark side everyone whispered about. This was the man who could make powerful people disappear with a snap of his fingers. But then, he reached out and gently straightened her collar. "Do not pack your bags, Zora," he said quietly. "Nobody is sending you away. I have spent my life making sure the world stays in the order I choose. And in my world, you stay." Zora realized then that protection came with a price. To be safe, she had to be tied to a man who lived outside the rules. She looked at the ripped papers on the floor and knew there was no going back to being just a maid. She was part of something much bigger and much more dangerous now. The city of Seoul was a sea of blinking lights outside the tall windows of the penthouse. Inside, the air was warm and smelled like jasmine tea. Zora sat on the edge of a velvet sofa, her fingers tracing the soft fabric of her green dress. The fear from the government officials had started to fade, but a new question was growing in her mind. She looked at Rowoon, who was standing by the glass, his hands tucked into the pockets of his dark trousers. He looked like a king, but he also looked very alone. "Why did you do it?" Zora asked softly. Her voice sounded small in the large room. "You didn't have to risk a scandal for a maid. You don't even know me." Rowoon did not turn around at first. He watched the tiny cars moving far below like glowing ants. "In this city, people only see what they want to see," he began. His voice was like a low hum. "They see a billionaire like Sang-woo and think he is a leader. They see a woman in a maid's uniform and think she is a ghost. They think because I have money and power now, I was born with a silver spoon in my mouth." He finally turned to face her. The harsh light of the city made his shadow long and sharp on the floor. "My mother was a kitchen worker," he said, and for the first time, Zora saw a flicker of real emotion in his steady eyes. She was a woman who was too loud and too large for the polite people she served. "I watched men like Sang-woo treat her like a rug for 20 years. I watched her shrink until there was nothing left of her but a cough and a tired smile." Zora felt a lump form in her throat. She thought about her own mother and the shape of leaving she had carried all the way from America. She thought about the 12-hour shifts and the way she had learned to walk on her tiptoes so no one would hear her coming. "When I saw Sang-woo raise his hand to you in that lobby," Rowoon continued, walking closer until he was standing right in front of her, "I didn't see a maid. I saw my mother. I saw every person who has ever been told they are too much or not enough. I decided a long time ago that once I had the power, I would never let the world delete someone like you again." He reached out and placed a hand on the back of the sofa, leaning down so they were eye to eye. "You think your size and your skin make you a target, Zora. But to me, you're the only real thing in this building full of plastic people. You're not a ghost. You're a person who has survived a world that tried to break her. That makes you more powerful than any billionaire." For the first time since she had landed in Korea, Zora felt a strange, hot tear run down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness. It was the feeling of a heavy weight finally being lifted off her chest. She wasn't just being protected because she was a job or a responsibility. She was being seen. Rowoon wasn't just a scary mafia boss. He was a boy who had remembered his mother's struggle and chose to change the ending of the story. In that quiet moment, the penthouse didn't feel like a cage or a hiding place. It felt like a home. Zora realized that she didn't have to be invisible anymore. She was valued, not for what she could clean, but for who she was. The day of the Grand Lotus Gala had arrived, and the hotel was glowing with even more gold and silver than usual. Zora walked through the front doors, but she didn't head for the service entrance. She walked right through the middle of the lobby. She wasn't wearing a blue and white striped uniform or carrying a heavy bucket of bleach. Instead, she wore a deep violet gown that flowed behind her like a royal cape. Her head was held high, and her dark skin shimmered under the chandeliers. She didn't feel like a ghost anymore. She felt like the main character. In the center of the room, Sang-woo was standing with a group of businessmen, laughing loudly as if he hadn't been on his knees scrubbing a floor just a week ago. When he saw Zora approaching, his laugh died in his throat. Beside him, Mrs. Park, the head housekeeper, dropped her glass of champagne. Her eyes went wide as she looked at the woman she used to call clumsy and too large. "What are you doing here?" Sang-woo hissed, his face turning that familiar, angry red. "I told you to leave this country. You don't belong in a room like this." Zora didn't flinch. She didn't look at her shoes or wait for someone to tell her it was okay to speak. She stepped into his space, her eyes steady and calm. "I belong wherever I choose to stand, Sang-woo," she said. Her voice was clear and reached the ears of everyone nearby. "You spent days trying to make me feel small because you were afraid of how much space I actually take up. But you can't fire me from my own life." Mrs. Park stepped forward, her voice shaking. "Zoraida, you are being very rude to a guest. You should remember your place." Zora turned to the woman who had spent years making her feel like an administrative error. "My place isn't in your shadows, Mrs. Park, and it isn't in a uniform that was meant to make me invisible. I was a great maid, but I am an even better person. You should have spent more time looking at my work and less time looking at my waistline." Just then, a heavy, familiar hand rested gently on the small of Zora's back. Rowoon stepped out from the crowd, looking as sharp as a diamond in his black suit. He didn't have to say a word. The entire room went silent as he looked at Sang-woo and Mrs. Park with a cold, great tiger gaze. They backed away instantly, realizing that the maid they had bullied was now the most protected person in the city. Rowoon leaned in and whispered to Zora, "Are you ready to go?" Zora looked around the Grand Lotus one last time. She saw the marble she had polished and the pillars she had hidden behind. She realized she didn't hate this place anymore. She was just finished with it. "Yes," she said, a real smile finally breaking across her face. "I'm ready." She turned her back on Sang-woo and the hotel, walking out the front doors into the fresh Seoul air. Zoraida Vance was no longer a maid, and she was no longer a target. She was a woman who had found her voice in a world of silence, and she was finally ready to see how far she could go.